In July of 2025, a 58-year-old man boarded a deportation flight inside the United States, believing he already knew where it would land. He had lived in America for nearly 50 years, since he was a small child. He had a green card, a life, a routine, right up until a criminal conviction stripped that status away and put him on a government watch list for removal. When the plane touched down, he was not standing on Jamaican soil, the country where he was born. He was standing in Eswatini, a small kingdom in southern Africa he had never once visited in his life, being processed into a maximum security prison, built for an entirely different kind of population, with no lawyer present and no clear answer to the only question that mattered to him in that moment. How long would he be there? He did not choose Eswatini. Nobody consulted him. He simply woke up removed from the only life he had built as an adult and landed somewhere he had never once imagined possible. His name is Orville Etoria, and by the time this story is finished, his case will have quietly reshaped how an entire Caribbean nation negotiates with the most powerful country on earth. This is not a story about a war. Nobody fired a shot over Orville Etoria. But it is a story about power, about how far a small island nation can push back against a superpower without breaking the relationship entirely, and about a memorandum, a set of numbers, and a prime minister who chose his words carefully enough to survive a public threat from a sitting member of the United States Congress. Stay with this one, because the second half of this story includes a federal court ruling that undercuts the very deal Jamaica just signed, two men who chose to vanish back into legal limbo rather than come home, and a diplomatic confrontation that barely made headlines outside the region, but that tells you everything about the tightrope every Caribbean government is walking right now. Before we go further, if this is your first time on Caribbean Journey, this channel exists to dig into the Caribbean and Guyanese stories that rarely get real, sourced coverage anywhere else. Not speculation, not hot takes, actual research. We are working toward 20,000 subscribers so we can keep building this kind of coverage out properly. And if you find value in what's about to unfold over the next 40 minutes, take a moment right now and subscribe. For a channel this size, it genuinely makes a difference. Now, back to Jamaica, and back to the 6 months that led up to Orville Etoria's flight. To understand why a memorandum full of technical numbers could carry this much weight, you have to understand what Jamaica actually is to the people watching this video. Jamaica became an independent nation in August of 1962, closing out more than 300 years of British colonial rule, while choosing to remain inside the Commonwealth, a coalition of nations that still recognizes the British monarch as a ceremonial head, even as every member governs itself. In the decades since, the United States became one of 3 countries, alongside Britain and Canada, that absorbed the largest waves of Jamaican migration, building the same diaspora communities in London, New York, and Toronto that this channel exists to speak to. Every dollar sent home, every visit back for a funeral or a wedding, every phone call checking on an aging parent, runs through the same relationship this entire story is about. A policy dispute over deportation transit numbers can sound distant and bureaucratic. It has never actually been distant. It runs straight through the lives of the people who left the island and the people who stayed. To understand why his case mattered so much, you have to go back to a single morning that reset the balance of power across the entire Caribbean Sea. It started quietly almost a year earlier. In August of 2025, the United States began moving warships, aircraft, and personnel into Caribbean waters, framed publicly as a counter-narcotics surge, an effort to slow the flow of drugs heading north. But what showed up did not look like a customs operation. The aircraft carrier USS Gerald R. Ford arrived in the region. F-35 fighter jets were deployed to Puerto Rico. Naval patrols spread across sea lanes that fishermen and ferry operators across the Caribbean had used their entire lives without a second thought. By December, American forces in the region numbered somewhere around 15,000 personnel, and the U.S. military had already carried out dozens of strikes on vessels it accused of smuggling narcotics, a campaign that, by some estimates, had already killed more than 100 people. Washington seized a vessel that became known publicly as the Zombie Tanker, allegedly carrying sanctioned Venezuelan oil, and shortly after declared a naval blockade on tankers carrying that same oil. Analysts watching the build-up in real time said the scale of it went far beyond anything a narcotics operation would require. Most of them suspected the real target wasn't drugs at all. It was the government of Venezuela. They were right. In the early hours of January the 3rd, 2026, the operation went from surveillance to strike. The United States launched a direct military action on Caracas and captured President Nicolas Maduro, along with his wife, Cilia Flores. Maduro was flown out of the country and later prosecuted. His vice president, Delcy Rodriguez, was sworn in as acting president in his place. Hundreds of political prisoners held inside Venezuela were released. Sanctions on Venezuelan oil were lifted, opening the door to privatizing the country's entire oil industry. Analysts who track the region closely now describe Venezuela as functioning, in practice, under heavy American financial and political influence, a total reversal for a government that had spent 2 decades positioning itself as Washington's loudest critic in the hemisphere. Picture what that morning looked like from Kingston. A sitting head of state, captured by American forces, less than 1,000 kilometers from Jamaica's own coastline. Warships sitting in waters Jamaican fishermen have worked for generations. For an ordinary fisherman working those same waters, none of this changed what the sea looked like from the deck of his boat. It changed everything about what could show up on the horizon without warning. And a wave of regional governments lining up publicly to support the operation. Trinidad and Tobago, the Dominican Republic, El Salvador, Guyana, Panama, and Puerto Rico were all named in American coverage as supportive of the effort. Argentina, Ecuador, and Paraguay offered political backing. The United Kingdom confirmed it had helped intercept a sanctioned vessel. Even the Dutch government signaled that roughly 1,000 of its own troops stationed in the Caribbean, along with its Coast Guard, could be pulled into the operation if things escalated further, though for now their role was limited to unarmed surveillance flights. The United States approached Grenada about building a temporary military radar base on its soil. Critics there pushed back hard, warning their Prime Minister that the whole buildup looked less like counter-narcotics and more like a pretext for a wider war with a country that, as far as Grenada was concerned, had done nothing to them directly. A similar request to Antigua and Barbuda was turned down outright, and the operation itself, formally named Operation Southern Spear, did not stop at Venezuela's border. By March of 2026, it had expanded in Ecuador, with American forces taking part in strikes against a group called Comandos de la Frontera, proof that Washington's willingness to use direct force in the region was not a one-time event. It was a posture, one that could be pointed at the next government and the next, depending on how circumstances shifted. Government by government, the same calculation was playing out across the region, quietly, in private. How much cooperation was necessary to stay in Washington's good graces, and how much would look to their own citizens like handing over an entire foreign policy to a foreign capital. This is the world Jamaica was operating in. A nation of roughly 3 million people with no military capable of resisting American pressure in any conventional sense, forced to calculate in real time exactly how much room it had left to negotiate, to question, and in some cases to simply say no. For Guyanese viewers specifically, Guyana's presence on that list of supportive governments carries its own weight. Guyana has spent years locked in a territorial dispute with Venezuela over the oil-rich Essequibo region, a dispute that predates any of this year's events by more than a century. A weakened, externally influenced Venezuela changes the entire calculus of that dispute, for better or worse, depending on who you ask. And it's part of why Guyana's support for the American operations reads differently than, say, Panama's or the Dominican Republic's. Every country on that list had its own reasons for standing where it stood, and those reasons rarely made it into the headlines that simply listed their names. So when Jamaica's National Security Minister, Dr. Horace Chang, stood in front of cameras in mid-June of 2026 to confirm a new agreement with the United States Department of Homeland Security, he was doing it inside a region that had just watched Washington remove a sitting president by force. Which is exactly what makes what he said next so unexpected. Jamaica had agreed to accept what the U.S. government calls third country nationals, not Jamaican citizens. People from entirely different countries. People the United States wanted to deport, but could not simply send home, for one legal reason or another. Washington has been building a list of nations willing to accept these deportees as a kind of way station before they're moved on to a final destination. Mexico had done it. El Salvador had done it. Uganda had done it. Jamaica was now on that list too. Here is where it gets interesting. Chang did not announce a blank check. He announced numbers. Jamaica would accept up to 25 people from other countries, every 2 weeks. Run that forward across a full year, and it works out to a hard ceiling of roughly 650 people at the absolute maximum, assuming the process never once triggered its own suspension clause. If more than 10 of them remained on Jamaican soil inside any 30-day window, the entire arrangement would automatically suspend itself. Every single person would go through health screening, identity verification, and a full criminal background check before they were ever allowed to set foot in the country, and Chang stated plainly that anyone with a criminal record would be turned away outright. And critically, Jamaica kept the power to reject any individual transfer it didn't agree with, case by case. 25 people every 2 weeks sounds almost bureaucratically small when you say it out loud until you remember that a single mishandled case, the wrong person sent at the wrong prison in the wrong country, had already happened once, publicly, months earlier. This wasn't Jamaica throwing its doors open. This was Jamaica building a lock into a door most countries in its position might have felt they had no say over at all. The government drew a hard line publicly too. Under international law, Jamaica is obligated to accept its own citizens back, no matter what they've done abroad. Nobody disputes that. What Chang was describing was something else entirely, a temporary transit arrangement for people who were not Jamaican at all. This is a structured, managed process to transit individuals through Jamaica to their final destination, Chang said. A careful line, and not everyone in Jamaica believed it would hold. Jamaica wasn't the only Caribbean nation trying to draw that same line. As scrutiny spread across the region, CARICOM governments more broadly moved to reassure their own populations that these arrangements were about temporary transit, not permanent resettlement, a distinction leaders leaned on hard to keep public trust intact. It's an easy distinction to state in a press release and a much harder one to prove in practice, especially once someone has already been living in your country for months while their onward destination remains unresolved. Whether that distinction actually holds up in practice is exactly what critics across the region, not just in Jamaica, have been demanding their governments prove. The opposition People's National Party moved fast. Their complaint wasn't just about the policy. It was about how it had been struck quietly, without the public being told first, at a moment when Jamaica's internal security, its international reputation, and its already stretched social infrastructure were all on the line. A spokesperson for the opposition, Donna Scott Motley, said Jamaicans deserved to know whether talks had even taken place before any commitments were made. Opposition leader Mark Golding went further, and this is where the story sharpens. Jamaica appears to be relying solely on background checks conducted by the United States, Golding said, without taking independent steps of our own to verify who is being sent to our shores. No responsible government outsources its national security due diligence to another country, however friendly. Jamaica must conduct its own independent verification of the background, security profile, and status of every individual before they set foot on Jamaican soil. That warning didn't stay inside Parliament. More than 500 protesters gathered in Kingston, according to the Washington Post, holding placards against what they saw as a secretive deal struck behind closed doors. Newsweek's coverage of the same demonstrations described a public mood less about rejecting cooperation with Washington outright and more about demanding transparency, a sense that decisions with real consequences for public safety were being made quietly and only confirmed once journalists and opposition politicians started asking pointed questions. The Jamaica Observer described weeks of political tension following the first reports that a deal even existed. Constitutional law expert Dr. Lloyd Barnett asked the government to answer something it hadn't addressed yet. Why should Jamaica be used as what he called a transition station at all when the United States, with infrastructure and resources Jamaica could never match, could presumably manage its own deportation logistics without pulling a Caribbean neighbor into it? He also pressed the government on what would happen if a person's country of origin refused to take them back after their time in Jamaica ended. Barnett wasn't alone in wanting that question answered directly. Every opposition figure raising it in Kingston that summer was, in effect, asking the same underlying thing. Once someone lands in Jamaica under this arrangement, whose responsibility do they actually become? And for how long if the machinery meant to move them onward simply stalls? Then the story got messier. A leaked United States diplomatic note surfaced, revealing that Jamaica's former ambassador to Washington, Audrey Marks, had at one point floated something far bigger, an entirely separate proposal under which Jamaica could eventually accept up to 10,000 third-country nationals, framed as a skilled migration program. 10,000 against a national population of roughly 3 million. That single number is what turned a policy debate into a full-blown controversy. 10,000 people is not a rounding error in a country of 3 million. It's the kind of figure that, had it gone forward quietly, would have reshaped entire communities before most Jamaicans even knew a conversation was happening. The fact that it surfaced at all came down to a leak, not a disclosure, and that detail is part of why the protests that followed weren't really about immigration policy in the abstract. They were about a government appearing to negotiate the country's future somewhere the public couldn't see it happen. Prime Minister Andrew Holness moved quickly to separate the two initiatives publicly, insisting the skilled migration idea was distinct from the transit memorandum Chang had already confirmed. In a nationwide news interview in late June, Holness admitted the memorandum had been signed, but said it had not yet been implemented on the ground, and that operational details were still being worked out. Operational details still being worked out in diplomatic language usually means one of two things. Either the mechanics genuinely aren't finalized yet, or the government isn't ready to say publicly what has effectively already been decided behind closed doors. Which one applies here still isn't clear, and Jamaica's own opposition has said as much publicly more than once. Underneath all of it sat a legal problem that changes how you should read everything that came before it. In February of 2026, months before Chang's announcement, a United States federal district court had already struck down the broader third-country removal policy as unlawful, ruling that Washington could not simply send migrants to countries that hadn't been formally designated to receive them, without proper notice. That should have been the end of the entire program. It wasn't. The policy kept operating anyway, while the ruling worked its way through appeals, meaning the legal ground Jamaica's own agreement was standing on was already cracked before the ink on the memorandum had even dried. A Department of Homeland Security spokesperson, asked about it directly, said only that the administration was utilizing all lawful options to carry out removals. As part of this wider push, the Trump administration has used a patchwork of agreements, many have made fully public, to deport more than 19,000 people to third countries, according to the advocacy group Third Country Removal Tracker. 25 people every 2 weeks is a small slice of a much larger machine, one still being challenged in American courtrooms even as it keeps running. That machine didn't build itself overnight either. Third country removal grew directly out of the administration's push to speed up deportations even when a person's home country wouldn't or couldn't take them back fast enough. Rather than hold people indefinitely inside the U.S., Washington began striking deals with a widening circle of nations in exchange for financial or diplomatic considerations that, in most cases, have never been made public. Jamaica's arrival on that list in 2026 placed it beside countries with wildly different governance records, a comparison Golding and Barnett have both pointed to directly when arguing Jamaica needs a far higher bar for transparency than some of the other participants. Every one of the thousands of people caught inside that machine has a story that looks, in outline, like Etoria's. A status revoked, a home country that can't or won't take them back quickly enough, a flight to somewhere they've never been, on terms nobody explained to them clearly beforehand. Jamaica's insistence on caps and screening didn't come out of an abstract legal seminar. It came out of watching, in real time, exactly what that machine can do to one of their own. Now go back to Orville Etoria, because his case is the reason all of this negotiating happened in the first place. Nearly 50 years in America, a green card revoked after a conviction. Deported not to Jamaica, the country of his birth, but to a maximum security prison in a country he had never seen, alongside for other third country nationals, all stripped of due process, all denied access to legal counsel according to his own lawyers. It took 2 full months of sustained diplomatic pressure from the Jamaican government, working with the International Organization for Migration, a United Nations agency that handles some of the most complex displacement cases on the planet, before Etoria finally came home in September of 2025. 2 months for a man whose only connection to that country was the fact that the United States chose to send him there. Here's the twist almost nobody outside Jamaica heard about. In mid-July of 2026, Jamaica's Ministry of Foreign Affairs confirmed that 2 more Jamaican citizens held in that same facility in Eswatini alongside Etoria had been offered the exact same path home. Consular assistance, a legal advisor, full government support to return. Both of them said no. The Foreign Ministry admitted it couldn't even determine their immigration status inside the United States, or secure any path back there either. As of this recording, officials are still trying to locate a 3rd citizen believed to be in a similar situation. 2 men, given the chance to walk free of the same prison Etoria fought 2 months to escape, choosing to stay. Neither government has explained why. Maybe they'd built something resembling a life inside a system most people would spend every waking hour trying to escape. Maybe returning to Jamaica carried complications nobody outside their immediate circle understands. The record doesn't say, and guessing would do a disservice to 2 men whose actual reasons remain theirs alone. That's the first act of this story. A government negotiating terms nobody expected it to fight for, on a memorandum shaped directly by watching what happened to one of its own citizens. The second act starts somewhere completely different, at a summit table in St. Kitts and Nevis, and on the surface, it has nothing to do with migration at all. In late February of 2026, Caribbean heads of government gathered in St. Kitts and Nevis for the 50th regular CARICOM summit, U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio was there, focused by most accounts on regional security cooperation and gauging where Caribbean governments stood on both Venezuela and the deepening crisis inside Cuba. Prime Minister Holness addressed that Cuban crisis directly, where the fallout from an American-engineered oil blockade had pushed the country toward severe hardship and energy shortages already spilling into public unrest. Holness struck a measured tone, acknowledging the suffering of ordinary Cubans while warning his fellow CARICOM leaders that instability wouldn't stay contained inside Cuba's borders. A prolonged crisis in Cuba will not remain confined to Cuba, Holness told the room. It will affect migration, security, and economic stability across the Caribbean basin. It is therefore important that we carefully consider this matter and take collective action. Holness wasn't raising a hypothetical. The Caribbean has watched Cuban instability spill outward before. In 1980, more than 120,000 Cubans left the island for the United States in what became known as the Mariel boat lift, triggered by economic desperation and a sudden opening at the port of Mariel. In 1994, a separate economic collapse sent tens of thousands more Cuban rafters across the Florida Straits on homemade vessels, an exodus that reshaped American and regional migration policy for years afterward. Both crises are exactly the kind of precedent a Caribbean Prime Minister has in mind when he warns, at a regional summit, that instability in Cuba never stays contained inside Cuba's own borders. That single, carefully balanced statement about regional consequences, not internal Cuban politics, was enough to draw a public threat from a sitting member of the United States Congress. Florida Republican Carlos Gimenez, born in Cuba, raised in the United States, and previously mayor of Miami-Dade County before his election to Congress, posted a direct response condemning Holness by name. Gimenez represents a South Florida district shaped heavily by Cuban-American politics, where any perceived softness toward Havana carries enormous weight, which goes a long way toward explaining why he reacted the way he did to a speech most other people in that room read as neutral. Addressing Holness in his role as leader of the ruling Jamaica Labour Party, Gimenez said he harshly condemned what he called an attempt to cover up for the moribund dictatorship in Cuba, and accused the Castro government of repeatedly meddling in Jamaican politics in the past to undermine Holness's own party. Then he ended the post with 4 words that made headlines across the region. Jamaica will face the consequences. It's worth pausing on how unusual that sentence actually is. Members of the United States Congress criticize foreign leaders constantly. They rarely threaten consequences in public against a small allied nation over a single paragraph of measured diplomatic language delivered at a regional summit most Americans never even heard about. Sit with that for a second. A sitting prime minister at an official regional summit raising a humanitarian and security concern about a neighboring crisis and getting publicly threatened by a member of the United States Congress for it. Not by the State Department, not by the administration officially represented in that same room. One congressman, former U.S. Ambassador to Jamaica Luis G. Moreno, called the idea that Holness' comments could trigger any real punitive action from Washington silly, insisting Jamaica's approach had been balanced and well within normal diplomatic bounds. One regional analyst added that Gimenez's threat hadn't generated any real concern among actual Jamaican policymakers, especially given that Secretary Rubio himself, at that same summit, was focused entirely on security cooperation, not on reprimanding Caribbean leaders for speaking their minds. But here's the part that complicates the whole narrative, and it's worth sitting with, because Jamaica's foreign policy this year has not been one straight line of defiance. Just weeks before that CARICOM summit in March of 2026, Jamaica canceled a decades-long cooperation agreement with Cuba that had allowed Cuban medical professionals to work on the island, a program the United States had criticized for years. That decision moved in the exact opposite direction of confrontation. It's a reminder that Jamaica has spent this entire year moving back and forth, aligning with Washington some moments, quietly pushing back in others, depending entirely on what's actually at stake in each individual decision. And this pattern isn't new either. In earlier years, Holness has publicly challenged the United States travel advisory system as it applies to Jamaica, arguing that the advisory level assigned to the country didn't reflect the real progress made on reducing violent crime, and that public perception had failed to catch up to the underlying data. That episode happened before any of this year's events, but it tells you something important. It's a small episode next to a deportation memorandum or a congressional threat, but it establishes the same instinct at work in all three moments. A government willing to publicly question Washington's read of Jamaica, rather than simply absorb it. Jamaica has a track record of pushing back, publicly and directly, whenever it believes American assessments of the country, on crime, on migration, on regional politics, are unfair or simply out of step with reality. This year's deportation fight and Holness's handling of the Cuba question aren't isolated sparks. They're the latest and most consequential entries in a pattern that's been building for a long time. Laid end to end, the last 12 months read like a single, continuous story instead of a string of disconnected headlines. August 2025, the American buildup begins. December, 15,000 troops in the region. January the 3rd, 2026, Caracas falls and Maduro is captured. Weeks later, Holness delivers his measured Cuba statement and finds himself publicly threatened within hours. That same month, a U.S. federal court rules the broader deportation policy unlawful. Early March, Jamaica cancels its Cuban medical agreements, siding with American pressure rather than against it. Mid-June, Chang confirms the deportation memorandum caps screening and right of refusal intact. Late June into July, protests fill Kingston. And by mid-July, two of the men once held alongside Etoria in Eswatini choose to stay in legal limbo rather than come home. 9 months, one small country. A running negotiation over exactly how much independence it can exercise while standing directly in the shadow of the most powerful military on the planet. If you're watching this from London, from Brooklyn, from Scarborough, thousands of kilometers from Kingston, here's why any of this should matter to you. It matters first because of what it reveals about the actual terms of the relationship. For decades, the working assumption across much of the Caribbean has been that when Washington asks, smaller nations answer quietly on America's terms. What Jamaica did this year, in the deportation negotiations and in how Holness handled the Cuba question, proves there's still room, a narrow one, but a real one, to negotiate those terms instead of simply accepting them. A cap of 25 people every 2 weeks, a suspension trigger, a right of refusal, opposition pressure that pushed the government toward stricter independent screening than the original deal even called for. None of that erases the fundamental power imbalance between a superpower and an island of 3 million people. But it proves that imbalance isn't absolute, and that public pressure, both from Jamaica's own citizens and its government's negotiating posture, can still move outcomes at the margins, even in a year when Washington just demonstrated in Venezuela exactly how far it's willing to go when it decides a government has crossed a line. It matters second because of Orville Etoria and because of the people still living through versions of his story right now. If you've got older relatives in the United States, people who've built a life there over decades under legal status that a single conviction could erase, the third country deportation system isn't some abstract policy debate happening in a Washington think tank. It's a real mechanism that already sent a man who'd lived in America for almost 50 years into a maximum security prison in a country he'd never seen, for months without due process, before diplomatic pressure finally got him out. The Safeguards Jamaica is now trying to build into any future version of this system. The caps, the screening, the right of refusal aren't bureaucratic technicalities. They're a direct response to what already happened to one of their own, and they carry a warning worth sitting with. Legal status in the United States, even decades of it, is not the same as permanent safety. A single conviction, sometimes years old, can unravel it entirely, and when it does, the process that follows offers very little say to the person living through it. It matters third because of what it says about Jamaica's standing in a region that's been reshaped in a single year. This is happening while the United States just removed a sitting president in Venezuela by force, while 15,000 American troops have moved through Caribbean waters, and while neighboring governments are being asked, sometimes quietly, sometimes not, to publicly fall in line behind Washington's position on Venezuela and Cuba. Jamaica's posture defending Cuba's humanitarian stakes in one breath while canceling a Cuban cooperation deal in the next, negotiating a deportation arrangement while publicly fighting over its terms, small state diplomacy playing out in real time, a country trying to preserve some independence of action without triggering a rupture with the partner it depends on most. Every diaspora community watching from abroad has a direct stake in whether that balancing act succeeds, because the version of Jamaica that emerges from this year, either one that held its ground on the details that mattered or one that quietly absorbed whatever terms it was handed, is the Jamaica everyone abroad will be sending money to, flying home to, and calling home for years afterward. And it matters fourth because of money, plainly. American visitors make up the largest share of Jamaica's tourism industry, an industry that touches hotels, transportation, food supply chains, and hundreds of thousands of jobs across the island. Money sent home by relatives abroad, much of it from the United States, remains one of the most consistent, most essential sources of income flowing into Jamaican households, filling gaps formal employment simply can't cover. None of that runs on autopilot. It runs on a relationship that has to be actively managed year after year, decision after decision, by people making exactly the kind of calls Chang and Holness made this year. Tourism, remittances, trade, travel advisories, every one of those threads runs downstream from the political relationship between Kingston and Washington. A congressman's threat over a Cuba statement might look like distant political theater from where you're sitting. On the ground, it's sitting directly above the economic foundation a very large share of Jamaican families, on the island and off it, depend on every single month. None of that shows up in a government press release about a memorandum of understanding. It shows up in a hotel worker's shift getting cut if American arrivals dip because of a travel advisory dispute. It shows up in a remittance transfer arriving smaller than expected because a relationship in Washington got a little rockier that month. The people who actually absorb the consequences of decisions like this one are almost never the ones sitting in the room where they're made. It matters a fifth way too, one that has nothing to do with Jamaica specifically and everything to do with precedent. Jamaica is not the only CARICOM government watching how this plays out. Every Caribbean nation weighing a similar arrangement with Washington, and there are several, is watching whether Jamaica's caps, its screening requirements, and its right of refusal actually hold up in practice, or whether they quietly erode the first time Washington wants more than 25 people moved in a 2-week window. Whatever Jamaica accepts or refuses to accept, over the next year effectively sets the opening terms for every other small nation in the region waiting for the same phone call from the same department in Washington. Before we get to how this ends, or rather, how it hasn't ended yet, I want to ask you something. Because this is exactly the kind of channel where I actually want to hear from you in the comments. If Caribbean Journey has been useful to you today, walking through a story most outlets either ignored or oversimplified into a single headline, this channel is still building toward 20,000 subscribers. And every one of you watching this far in is exactly who this channel is made for. If you haven't already, subscribe now. It costs nothing, and it's the single biggest thing that helps a research-driven channel like this one keep going. There are still real gaps in this story, and pretending otherwise would be dishonest. The full text of the memorandum between Jamaica and the U.S. Department of Homeland Security has never been publicly released by either government, which means everything we know about screening, refusal rights, and suspension triggers comes from official statements, not the document itself. Compensation terms for Jamaica's participation were still being negotiated as of the most recent reporting, with no confirmed dollar figure attached. The federal appeal of that court ruling is still pending, meaning the legal foundation for the entire program in Jamaica and everywhere else it operates remains unsettled at the highest levels of the American judicial system. And the reasons two Jamaican citizens chose to stay in limbo in Eswatini rather than come home after everything Etoria went through in that same building have never been explained publicly by either government. That gap in the record deserves to stay a gap, not a guess. One more thing worth knowing, because it complicates any version of this story that tries to flatten Jamaica into either a defiant underdog or a quiet dependent. All of this played out during a year Jamaica also spent recovering from Hurricane Melissa, described as the most powerful storm to hit the island since record-keeping began 174 years ago. Roofs torn off homes that had stood for generations. Roads washed out in communities that depend on those same roads to move crops, patients, and children to school. Aid organizations, diaspora fundraising, and support networks stretching from Kingston to Miami to London all got pulled into the recovery effort, a reminder that the same United States generating friction through deportation policy and congressional threats. This year is also the country Jamaica leans on hardest when a storm of that scale tears through the island. Jamaica's relationship with Washington in 2026 was never a straight line of resistance. It was a country holding two realities at once, standing firm on specific points of fairness and sovereignty, while still depending on that exact same relationship for the support its people needed to recover from one of the worst disasters in its recorded history. Try holding both of those truths in your head at the same time. It's uncomfortable, and it's also exactly what small state diplomacy actually requires. There's a version of this story where the appellate court upholds February's ruling, and the legal basis for arrangements like Jamaica's evaporates almost overnight, forcing Washington back to the table with every country on that list. There's another version where the ruling gets overturned, and third country removal simply becomes a permanent, expanding feature of American immigration enforcement, with Jamaica's cap of 25 every 2 weeks looking, in hindsight, like an opening offer in a negotiation that only grows from here. Nobody, not Chang, not Golding, not the courts themselves, knows yet which version this becomes. What's certain is that the outcome won't be decided in Kingston alone, and there's still the shadow of that 10,000-person proposal hanging over all of it. Holness has drawn a clear line between the 25-person transit deal and Marx's original skilled migration idea, but the same relationship, the same department in Washington, and the same underlying pressure to manage American deportation numbers sits behind both. Nothing said publicly so far rules out that larger number resurfacing in some form if the smaller arrangement holds and Washington decides it worked. So where does this actually leave things? The court appeal will take months, maybe longer, to resolve. The compensation terms remain undisclosed. And the bigger question hanging over the entire Caribbean, how much room a small nation really has to negotiate with the country that dominates its trade, its tourism, its remittances, and now, after January's operation in Venezuela, its sense of regional security isn't a question Jamaica alone gets to answer. What Jamaica proved this year is that the answer isn't zero, a cap negotiated, a right of refusal secured. A citizen brought home from a prison on the other side of the world after 2 months of pressure that never let up. A prime minister who chose careful language over silence even after a sitting member of the United States Congress suggested there'd be a price for it. Small moves against the scale of a hemisphere reshaped by American military force in a single January morning. But moves Jamaica made on its own terms, in a year when very few countries in the region could say the same. Orville Etoria is home now, back in Jamaica, back among people who know his name instead of a prison number in a country that was never his. 2 other men, given that same chance, are still somewhere in between. That gap between what Jamaica secured and what it couldn't fully guarantee is, in the end, the most honest way to describe where this entire story actually stands. Here's what I actually want to know from you. Jamaica negotiated caps, screening, and a right of refusal into a deal it could have simply been told to accept. No questions asked. Was that enough? Or should a country in Jamaica's position have walked away from the entire arrangement, regardless of what it might have cost the relationship with Washington. Tell me what you would have done in that position in the comments below. And if you're watching this from London, from Toronto, from New York, tell me whether a story like this changes anything about how you see home and how much say a place like Jamaica really gets to have in its own future. If this kind of research-driven coverage is worth your time, subscribe before you go. We're working toward 20,000 subscribers together. And Caribbean Journey exists because people exactly like you decided the real story was worth an hour of your attention instead of a 2-minute headline. There's more of this coming, the court appeal, the compensation terms, whatever happens to those two men still weighing their options in Eswatini, and I'd rather you hear it here, with the sourcing laid out plainly, than piece it together from a dozen conflicting headlines later. That's the whole point of a channel like this one. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.